All right, so we've been looking at Daniel 8, and we are. Well, I'm going to turn off my captions. It's spitting back to me everything I'm saying. Morning, Elizabeth. All right, so we've been looking at Daniel 8, of course, and last week we discussed how the vision in Daniel 8 is considerable. That is, it's proportionally a big chunk of the chapter. Goes down into about here, and then finally, which we went through quite a bit, the two animals, the ram and the goat. Remember, the ram is a sheep, timid creature, even though he's a ram, but and they're both male, so you know they're going to fight and be naturally combative and naturally wanting to dominate. So they're going to fight, which they do, but the goat is faster and smarter, right? So that's why he wins. And of course, the ram is Persia, and the goat is Greece. We're told that expressly by the angel. But the main focus in chapter 8, as in chapter 7, is this little horn. So this little horn comes out of one of the four horn. Remember, the goat had initially one conspicuous horn, which was Alexander the Great, and then out of that one horn, Alexander died. Of course, he swept across the east in just 10 years, dominating the Persian armies and destroying them viciously, destroying them wherever he could. He killed everyone, and took Egypt and took Palestine and all those areas way out, all the way to the Indus River Valley. He went all the way out to India, went to the Caspian Sea, just way out, and then came back to Babylon, and then he died in Babylon, and then his kingdom was divided to among four of his generals, and the two most important or famous of which are Ptolemy and Seleucus. All right, so we had that sort of description earlier, and where it says right here, just to highlight the text, instead of that one horn, there came up four conspicuous horns, and note it adds toward the four winds of heaven, which just means to the four, sort of, so to speak, the four corners of the world. If the four directions, four winds of heaven refers to the different winds: south wind, east wind, west wind, north wind. So Ptolemy is down in the south, and Seleucus is in the east, and they become the more prominent ones, because you all have at least heard of the Ptolemaic Empire for sure, and you may have heard of the Seleucid Empire, but they're all just Greek empires that are trying to get along who won't get along. They're like brothers in the backseat of a car who draw a line between them, or they don't have to be brothers, do they? They can be girls. They, how you do the line between you on a trip, and then you fight over the line, and you do this to your sibling. You take your finger and you touch the other side of the line just to spite them, see how they'll react. And anyway, so they were doing these kinds of things, but of course they led to wars. And then there's this little horn, which came out of those four, and it grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw to the ground. We'll have to talk about what that means. And trampled on them, and it became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And the host of it will be given over together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper for a limited number of time, 2,300 evenings and mornings, which is, if the evening and mornings are combined, then it means 2,300 days, right? which is about 6 years. If it means 2300, let me see if I get this right. Or excuse me, if they're combined, it's about 3 years. If they're separate, then it's about 6 years. Anyway, commentaries are not quite sure whether this should be 3 years or 6 years. And it's not going to be crucial to what we do, but just so you know, there's some debate about how to read that. And we're not going to, unless somebody thinks it's super important, then I don't know why. It's just a time frame, a limited time frame, and we'll talk a little bit more about what it might apply to in a bit. All right, so just in the vision itself, the little horn, as we noted last time, chapter 7's little horn is a little different. It's obviously very similar. They're both little horns, and they both seem especially blasphemous, arrogant, egregious, challenging the Most High God Himself. And yet, in chapter 8, where it describes all of this, as we're going to see here shortly, I'll read it. It's going to be described as the time of the end. And yet, this particular detail about this little horn is not the final beast that is that presumably in chapter 7 is still in power when the Son of Man shows up, but is rather a little horn from the days that relate back to Greece in some way. So all that gets a bit confusing, and we'll see if we can flesh it out a little bit today, or at least offer some different ways that people have read it. Now, the thing I would point out is that the little descriptions here about the little horn, that it says here, even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground. Now, and trampled on them. Now, in the actual image of the dream, it's clear that the stars are stars, right? Meaning the stars are that. In other words, the little horn that's on the head of this goat is so arrogant and so bold that it's not content to fight against earthly powers, but it is determined to challenge and confront and even find victory over heavenly powers. Okay? I mean, that's the idea, right? That he's even attacked the very host of heaven. Some of the stars are thrown to the ground and trampled. And it became great. He became so great that he was even as great as the prince of the stars of heaven, of the host of heaven. He sees himself as a divine prince over a divine army of these stars. Now, there's what exactly is that referring to? That's the question. Anyone have an idea of what it might be referring to? Lucifer. You meaning that the little horn is taking on Lucifer? Is that what you mean by? Maybe, okay. Well, the little horn, keep in mind, is going to be assaulting. Is going to be removing the daily burnt offering that happened in the morning and in the evening in the temple, and the sanctuary of Jerusalem will be sacked by the little horn. So it's unlikely that the Lucifer would be doing that, and also, well, I take it back. Lucifer is a good suggestion in the sense that if you asked who was responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, and you say, well, I mean, it's the Roman governor, yeah, it's Pilate, right? He had to authorize the crucifixion, and it's the Sanhedrin, because they had to bring their charges against Jesus and haul him to Pontius Pilate and so on. But then the Luke and John in particular are pretty clear that these governors are not acting alone, that there is a dark shadow, a dark power. As it says in Luke, at the arrest of Jesus, Jesus says, this is your hour and the power of darkness. And then, of course, in John, it specifically states that the devil enters into Judas Iscariot as he carries out his deed. So we're not, the evangelist doesn't want us to be unaware that Lucifer is operating in that sense. But here, the little horn coming out of Greece, as somebody pointed out already, I didn't see who it was, but somebody typed in there, is likely Antiochus Epiphanes. We started to talk about him last week, but I'll write his name here. Antiochus Epiphanes, as he was called, Antiochus the Fourth, but Epiphanes is his title. Epiphanes is a term that was used of gods manifesting themselves. So even his name was a sort of divine epithet. Anyone want to guess what city was named after the Antiochian family? That title, there's a famous city named after. Yes, very good guess. Antioch. Yeah, you all certainly have heard of Antioch. So where the first place where the early Christians were called Christians, and it became a dominant city in the early church, and was one of the mother cities, you might call it, for many centuries. People looked to Antioch for guidance. All right, but this idea of stars being thrown down, assuming it's Antiochus Epiphanes who's going after the stars. Again, he's a little horn on the head of a goat. Why would he be? Doesn't he know his place? I mean, he's just on Earth. There's no point fighting the stars. But here he actually fights the stars and then has some victory over the stars. So what do you mean he does not? You mean he does not have victory? Oh yeah, for sure. He doesn't just think he's small. Right. Anyway, so he is it's the fact that he has some success is what makes this sort of a mystery, right? It's one thing to sort of assail the stars of the sky, but then that he had some success, it's quite interesting. But anyway, the point is that the stars represent something above the earth, out beyond the earth, right? That's the idea. And then that is coupled with the next statement, which is he became great, even as great as the prince of the host. So, and then it talks about him attacking the temple. So my point is, the bit about the stars, the host of heaven, is that they are connected to being servants of the prince. There is a prince over this heavenly host, and that it relates to the sanctuary, the temple, and the regular burnt offering. So all that is to say, it's very likely, at least it strikes me, that it's referring to the powers in Jerusalem, right? Because remember, at this time, we're talking now around it's around this date here, 170 BC, and so remember, Daniel was taken in 600, right? So Daniel is taken, captured around 600 BC. Daniel has a vision looking forward. Okay. Nehemiah, right? We're talking, his under Persia, right, is sent back to Israel. I'm going to be very loose here with our times, around 500 BC. Okay, so it's just, I know it's not exact if you know the date, but anyway, it's just I'll round it for ease. That's so about 100 years later anyway. So Daniel, of course, is at the end of his life, or dead anyway, one of the two. And then Nehemiah is going to go back. And what does Nehemiah and Ezra, what are they a part of? What do they do when they get back to Jerusalem? They rebuild the temple, right? And they begin to rebuild the city. So that exists for quite a while before you get to Alexander the Great and the goat. And to put one more date on there, Alexander, the Greeks, right? We're looking at about 330. We'll just make it a nice rounded. I'll just say 300 for ease. About 300 BC. Okay, is Alexander the Great. So you see Persia there in 500. You see the Greeks around 300. So a couple hundred years later, and then you got to go another 150 years about before you get to Antiochus. Okay, and not long after Antiochus, the Romans will sweep through Greece and will take over Greece. Okay, so Antiochus represents sort of the end of the Greek hegemony over the Mediterranean Sea, right? But in 170, you have Jews who have now been living for a long time, many years, not just decades, but centuries, have been living in Jerusalem. The temple is operating. You have the Pharisees and the Sadducees forming. Pharisees, remember the word Pharisee means separatists. And you have the Sadducees, which are the word Sadducee comes from Zadok. You remember the priest, Zadok the priest. Perhaps you've seen his name many times, but that's where Sadducee comes from, as a famous high priestly name. And so the leaders in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, which is leading Jerusalem, has a high priest, and the high priest is a Sadducee. Okay, the high priests were affluent, generally, and were sort of old guard, and they purchased their high priesthood. Right, they bought it from the Seleucid or the Ptolemaic Empire. Whoever was leading at the time, they would buy their power, just as Herod did from the Romans and so on. You buy your position. Someone else can outbid you. So they tend to be very affluent, and but they are leaders. Okay. There are, of course, in the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, and they are a lot more conservative, less affluent than the Sadducees, and they tend to be the politicians, if you want to say that are more liked by the common man, because they're more conservative and they sort of represent the more earthly values. Don't get me wrong, because they had a religious element, a strong religious responsibility to lead the country spiritually, the nation. They also were could be viewed as hypocritical and so on. But we do too, right? If no doubt you all identify with one set of politicians, and just because you're a politician who identifies with the average man, so to speak, doesn't mean you can't at times be hypocritical and everybody see it. All right. So anyway, that's just to tell you a little bit where the sort of framework is of Jerusalem. And stars. So let's talk for a second about stars. What on earth are stars supposed to represent? Well, this is going to be very important because you're going to see it in the book of Jude. Hold on just a second while I pull this up. And no, not the stars. Okay, I have it, so I need to stop presenting this text and pull up our other Bible version. Now, this might be a little smaller, this print. Well, why don't I just jump over instead of doing that? Hold on a second. Let me just jump to the actual text where it gets bigger. And you'll see in Jude, so you can see this, right? This other text from Jude. Okay. So if you look at verse 13, it says this description, wandering stars. Wandering stars. Now let me just go back a little bit. It says, woe to them. It's talking about false prophets. It says they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion. These are hidden reefs at your love feast. They feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves, waterless clouds swept away by the winds, fruitless trees twice dead, uprooted, and so on. Wandering stars, for whom the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved forever. So that idea that they're wandering stars, in one sense, these in other words, the false prophets are described, the false teachers, as wandering stars. They're wandering in part because they're in the outer, they're stuck in the outer darkness. Okay, this is talking about their punishment. They're going to be stuck in the outer darkness. So stars are suitable for that. But then, of course, you also see stars in this other book here. You may have heard of it, the book of the Revelation, where it talks about how Jesus has 7 stars in his right hand. And then we're told what the 7 stars are. The 7 stars are, well, it says here, angels. Well, it's that all that means is the Greek word is the word angeli. And the word angeli means messenger. Okay, now sometimes that messenger is a divine messenger from heaven. Other times it's a human messenger. So there's a disagreement here about these messengers in the Revelation. Some take it to mean actual angels, like this translation, the ESV assumes these are angels. Other people interpret them as human messengers in the sense of the prophets and teachers who lead the churches, which is my own inclination. But what I want to talk about is the connection between Daniel's stars, the little horn taking out the stars, and then Jude speaking of false teachers as wandering stars, and then the Revelation addressing, presenting stars as leaders of the churches. Again, that you could believe that whether they're angels or not, but they're leaders of the churches anyway, because each of these letters in Revelation are addressed to stars. So let's try and pull all of this kind of mystery into the light. How's that? No pun intended. So the star, what were stars for? What did they do? If you were in the ancient world, I mean, well, actually, let's start with Genesis. God created the stars, and he tells us what the utility of stars is. Anyone remember? Okay, well, you want to remember the exact wording from Genesis? Yes, that they're a guiding light. There's a very famous story in the Gospels, isn't there, about a star being a guide. But in Genesis 1, it says that the stars were created for, yes, well, astronomy, yes, for seasons and for days and for years and so on. They mark out and give order and structure to the year. But they do that in the way they're placed in the sky, right? They give order and so on. And of course, the sun is part of them. That's one of the great lights. And yes, and they rule, and their rule and their guidance also applies to navigation, doesn't it? If you're on a ship in the middle of the sea, how possibly could you know where you're going in the ancient world at night? How, it's one thing during the day to use the sun, but how would you know you're going at night? Well, they use the stars as navigation. So I do this every year with students at some point in my class, as I say to them, imagine that you were, we put you in a car and we told you to drive to, say, California, but we're not going to give you any maps and no smartphones, no GPS. So you have to drive to California. Okay. You can't ask anybody for help. You can stay in hotels, that's fine, but you can have no access to maps and no access to GPS. You know, how are you going to get there? Do you think you can get there? And you'd be surprised how long it takes students to figure out that they can just use the sun and where it sets as the direction they need to drive to, right? As long as you're driving in the direction where the sun is setting, then, or where the sun is headed to set, you know, you just follow it through the day and you can see where it's heading to, and you just follow it to where it's going to set, and you're going to eventually hit California, right? You'd have to drive way, 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 way in a different, you'd have to be very bad at seeing where the sun is setting to hit Seattle, you know? So we use these as navigation. Let me get back to Daniel while we're doing this. So in what sense then is, say, a false teacher, I just did that one. In what sense is a false teacher a wandering star? Well, what is a wanderer? What is a wandering star referring to? Anyone know? Yeah, it means it has no direction. So just to be clear, you all are seeing the Daniel text again, right? Good. Well, let me tell you what the word yes, Pam, fantastic. Yeah, planet in Greek, the word planetes means a wanderer. Now, why on earth are the planets wanderers? Well, because, as you know, the Earth is rotating on its own axis, and it leaves the impression that the stars are all going around us every night in the exact same way, right? And at the exact same time of year, you know where the stars are going to be. It's totally predictable. You know that the Big Dipper is always going to be in the north sky, and you know that that every single year, without exception, that the North Star is going to be in the north. You know, it doesn't change. Okay, it's perfectly predictable, and the reason for that is because those stars are, you know, light years distant from Earth, and they're not actually moving around us. We're just spinning, and we just see them in the exact same position every night. But of course, the planets are not like that, are they? They're not way, 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 way out there where they are fixed, so to speak, relative to the Earth, but rather the planets, along with the Earth, are orbiting the sun. And so when we see the planets, they're going around like we are, but a lot of them are farther out, and some are a little closer. And what that means is that it's a little bit like we're driving past them sometimes, or they're driving past us. So have you all been like ever you're on the highway, and maybe you nap on a trip or something, and then you wake up, and if your car is going past another car for a split second, it leaves the illusion that the other car is reversing. You know how that can feel? Or maybe you're at a stoplight and a car starts to move, or your car starts to move, but you're not driving, and so it feels like they're backing up. Okay, you've had that happen. So what happens is, as you approach a planet, it's going to sort of slow down, and then when you whip around, it's going to speed up. So what the planets do is they follow really funky paths in the night sky. They don't just go like the Big Dipper does every night, the exact same through the sky. Planets will take a very kind of like this. They'll seem like they're going forward, and then they'll look like they're going backwards, and then they'll start going forward again. And that keep in mind, I mean, if you're charting them every day, you're charting their path each night and following their path. Eventually that path takes on some very strange squiggly lines, and they appear to wander differently from all of the stars, because stars are the same every night, whereas the planets are not following a nice, easy path. And this really boggled the minds of the ancient man, mind of the ancient man. Like, well, how do you explain? How do we explain this? And it created massive problems for all of the elaborate theories to explain why this is working out the way it is, because humans assumed the world is ordered, and the idea that it was disordered was the idea that the world was fundamentally chaotic was unacceptable. So there was always an attempt to try and find the answer, the solution to the order. How is this actually ordered in some way? And eventually, that problem of the planets not conforming nicely to the math is what triggered a man named Copernicus to come up with to rather adopt one of the ancient theories, which was that the Earth wasn't the center and everything was rotating around it, but that instead the sun was the center, a heliocentric view. So anyway, little science lesson there to get to Daniel 8. Why are we doing all this? Because the false teachers, the false prophets, are called planets, wandering stars, because you cannot guide yourself off of them, because they don't follow a reliable path. It's a wandering path, and therefore you cannot navigate from their leadership. In other words, the wandering stars analogy or metaphor in Jude is that the leaders of churches, which were false leaders, false teachers, were unreliable guides. Okay, well, now go to Daniel or go to the Revelation and read stars in that light. That stars are referring to guides, human guides, though, who are connected to God. That's why they're stars and not just a shepherd or something. They're stars because they have a relationship with God, and they're ruled by God, the Prince of the host, and they're subject to him, and therefore they become guides. In other words, they're a fitting metaphor for the leaders of the people of God. All right. So what does Antiochus do? Antiochus is going to assail the leaders of Israel, and then he's going to take away the burnt offering and sacrifice a pig on the altar in the temple, and so on. All right, so now comes the description of and of course he'll throw truth. Maybe the most important thing that it says he does here is he throws truth to the ground, and yet he still acts and prospers. Okay. All right, so Daniel wants the interpretation, and the interpretation comes to him that this is referring to the kings of Media and Persia, the ram is, and the goat is referring to the king of Greece. And it says the great horn between his eyes is the first king. That's Alexander, right? He's the first one, Alexander the Great. And then he will die, and there'll be 4 other kings that come out of him, of which, again, that's the Seleucid and Ptolemaic. Ptolemy, remember, ruled Egypt, and Seleucus ruled Syria and Persia and Babylon, and that area into the north and east. And then notice what it says, at the latter end of their kingdom. At the latter end. Now, where did we put Antiochus? See our little time map here? We have these guys here, and then Antiochus, if I could grab him, there he is. If I could grab him, right, he's down here. Okay, so we have Daniel captured a young man around 600, Persia reigning from around 500 to 300, Alexander the Great, the Greeks ruling from 300, and then Antiochus, as you see, his date here is 170. And by around 150, 20 years later, is when the Romans will sack Greece. Okay, so the Romans take over around 150 in Greece. So you have Antiochus is at the latter end. Now, this accuracy here, where it says the latter end, is going to be 250 years after Daniel. And because it's so accurate in its description of Antiochus, some of the professors that I had, and certainly many that I read when I was in university, all said that Daniel could not have been written, at least Daniel chapter 8, could not have been written by Daniel in the Babylonian times or in the early Persian Empire. That Daniel chapter 8, as well as some of the latter chapters of Daniel, must have been written after the actual person, Antiochus Epiphanes, lived and carried out his brutal reign over Israel. And the reason they conclude that is because the details we're about to read are simply too accurate. They align so nicely with what Antiochus Epiphanes actually did and what we know of Antiochus's character, that it's simply implausible from if you're a sort of secular historian, you're probably not going to conclude that these books are true miraculous supernatural prophecies. So they're going to say this book was written later on those grounds, alone. So just to tell you how it lines up so accurately, that's really not in debate. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're a secular or atheist or Christian or Jewish historian looking at Daniel 8, when it comes to the description of Antiochus, both his chronological reference point of being at the latter end of their kingdom, as well as the things he actually does to the temple and so on, there's not really in dispute that it's actually referring to Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay. It's just too accurate of a description. But of course, it doesn't give his name. It just describes him as the little horn. And what is he going to do? Well, it's going to say, when the transgressors have reached their limit. So that's a trigger. In other words, when will this king come? He will come when the transgressors have reached their limit. In other words, somebody is transgressing, and the transgression is going to crescendo. It's going to become exceedingly transgressive. In other words, wickedness will abound in some way. It's, in other words, the trigger for Antiochus coming to attack the temple will be the result of transgressors who have gone off the rails. Now, most people interpret this as the leaders of Israel, the stars, who have, in that sense, wandered. They're going off into violations of the Mosaic law that are extreme enough that God brings Antiochus as a judgment. That appears to be what that expression means. That but that won't surprise us if I asked you now, why did God send Nebuchadnezzar to attack the temple in Jerusalem? What does Daniel say is the reason for that? Well, in our next chapter, chapter 9, Daniel's going to go into at length, why did God bring the Babylonians to assail and attack Israel? And the answer is because of Israel's own sin and rebellion and transgression. That's what Daniel will say. If you ask Isaiah, why was God going to send the Assyrians and then the Babylonians to attack Israel? And Isaiah the prophet says, because of the sin and the rebellion and the transgression of Israel and of her leaders. So, in other words, that's the common way. If you ask Amos, if you ask Jeremiah, we could go on and on. So it's not a surprise then that Antiochus is being brought as a judgment because after living for 250 years in the land for a second time, right? This actually, it's a third time. Abram and his family lived in the land, and then they ended up in Egypt. And then Joshua and the descendants of that generation lived in Israel for a millennium, 1,000 years, and then they were judged and taken out by Nebuchadnezzar and the second, and the Assyrians first, and then Israel goes back a third time, is in the land, and then now Antiochus comes. But Antiochus doesn't remove Jews from the land. The Jews continue to live in the land. But that's how Daniel is viewing the bringing of Antiochus by God into the picture at the end of this rule of the two Gentile powers, which is that Israel's own transgressions, the leaders, presumably, in particular, have failed to such a great extent, have rebelled against God, that God brings Antiochus. Now, if you want to know what did these leaders actually do, what did the high priests and so on do that was so bad that God brought Antiochus Epiphanes and his wicked reign on them? And that's where it's helpful to read the books of Maccabees, the first two books. And what happened was Antiochus initially wanted to, as a general rule, and the Greeks were not ruthless and brutal towards cities, so long as you surrendered. I mean, as long as you surrendered, the Greeks were, their normal practice was to appoint local people as leaders over their own people, and then the leaders had to be subject to the Greeks. And that worked out fairly well in a lot of cities because the Greeks would come and they would build gymnasiums and even some early baths, and they would bring theater and bring culture. You know, they were a sophisticated intellectual culture and art, and your city could be helped by the Greeks in some ways. Anyway, you didn't have a choice because they had the power, so you would surrender to them, and then they would come and they would transplant Greeks into your city, And they would bring wealthy Greeks to come and live in the city, industrious Greeks, and they would be, you know, a proportion of your population, and then they would be part of the leadership, helping to guide that city. And of course, if you wanted to truly be successful, you had to learn Greek and traffic throughout the Greek Empire with commerce and so on. And this is why everybody eventually learned Greek. And that's why the New Testament was written in Greek, even though most of it was written by Jews. That is to say, people who were Jewish, people who were born Jews, right? The Apostle Paul and so on wrote in Greek, even though he was a Hebrew. So they would, in other words, they're imposing the Greek language and the Greek culture upon your city. Now, that's not going to work very well in Jerusalem, is it? Because in Jerusalem, their religion is very different from all the other religions. You can't just bring in the worship of Zeus and of Aphrodite and of Hera and add temples into the city and so on. That's going to cause massive problems in Jerusalem, because they are sworn by their first command of the Sinaitic covenant that they cannot worship any other gods, and they can't blaspheme the name of Yahweh. So that's not going to work. But what happened was the high priests, who generally were more secular minded and had been educated and wanted the benefits of the Greek culture, often corroborated with the Greek rulers to try and persuade the average Jerusalemites to yield to the imposition of Greek culture. And one of the things they did was they wanted the Jews to refer to Yahweh as Zeus. Just call him Zeus. I mean, what does it matter what you call God, right? Just call him Zeus, and then we can all get along and be happy. It's the same basic idea of God and so on. And so the high priests themselves actually, according to the books of Maccabees, the high priests collaborated along with the efforts of the Greek kings to try to get Jerusalemites to sort of go along with the Hellenization program. And that may be what this means when it says transgressors have reached their limit, that they were no longer stars that you could rely upon to guide you spiritually. There was no leadership left in the high priesthood anyway, and in some of the other leaders. So Antiochus comes, and what is Antiochus? He is a king of bold face. And as we're going to see, he's going to exalt, well, let's just read his thing. One who understands riddles, that means he's smart. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. He shall cause fearful destruction, shall succeed in what he does, destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. That seems to be what used to be called stars and hosts in heaven, right? Now they're called the saints, which are, of course, people in Jerusalem. By his cunning, he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. So he's a deceiver. He's fraudulent. He doesn't value the truth, right? He casts truth to the ground. And in his own mind, he shall become great. Without warning, he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, meaning God. And then he shall be broken by no human hand. Okay, so what's the flavor of Antiochus? Well, Antiochus is setting himself up as a rival, not just to the stars. He's not just another star. He's setting himself up as the prince of the hosts of heaven, of the stars of heaven, meaning God. So I think the internal logic of Antiochus from the perspective of God is that if the leaders of Israel want a foreign power like Antiochus to usurp the commands of God, in other words, these high priests were no longer believers in God. They didn't take God seriously. What does it say of Sadducees in the New Testament? Do you remember what it says about them? We know what they don't believe in. They don't believe in resurrections. They don't believe in spirit. They don't believe in the spiritual world at all. They don't believe in angels, we're told. Remember, Paul stirred up that fight that one time in the temple where he said he was on trial for proclaiming the resurrection of the dead. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees got in an argument. Remember, the Sadducees brought that test question to Jesus about the woman who ends up marrying the 7 brothers, and in the afterlife, whose wife is she? They're trying to show that resurrections don't happen. In other words, the Sadducees, the leaders, have become thoroughly Hellenized. They're secular. They they went to Harvard and they got to thinking like Cambridge people. And all this religion stuff seemed kind of backwards and embarrassing because nobody who's at the center of, Oxford and Cambridge and so on believes any of these old barbaric stories. We all know they're false and mythical. So so we just need to teach the average person who's, the average person is not too bright. They haven't been educated like we have. And so we have to teach them that these old stories are valuable as sort of old moral tales, the way Aesop's fables are, but we're not to take these ancient writings too seriously. We've got new ways of thinking, new ideas. So anyway, since Antiochus is the sort of embodiment of the Greek way of thinking, then God brings Antiochus upon the Jews. Now, Antiochus, the actual immediate reason why he's so upset that he attacks the Israelites, from his perspective, it's not that important. It all has to do with loyalty and his fear of losing his power. But from God's perspective, that brief time of, it's only just a few years, where Antiochus sacrifices the pig. He sets up a golden statue of Zeus. Some people think it might be an altar. It might be an altar and a statue, so we're not totally sure. Anyway, he sets it up in the temple of Jerusalem. He bans the possession of the Torah. If you have a copy of the Old Testament, the Torah, then you would be killed. If you circumcise your child, you and the baby can be killed. They would throw women off the rocks and kill them along with the babies. Sometimes they would kill the baby and hang it around their neck. Just a brutal campaign for a few years. And it's the Maccabean revolt that restores the temple. And you know what happens after they defeat Antiochus is the Jews want to relight the candles, the lamps in the temple, but they don't have enough oil. And so they light it, and supernaturally the oil lasts for a week. And they rededicate the temple. Okay? And that revolt is led by the Maccabees. And the word for the dedication of the temple is Hanukkah. It's the word Hanukkah. So the feast of Hanukkah, which of course the festival is still celebrated, is when they revolted against Antiochus. But anyways, Antiochus set himself up as a kind of god, as an arrogant divine type leader who demanded that his commands replace the commands of Yahweh, and that Jews now worship Zeus and so on. So in other words, he becomes sort of a well, if this is what you want as leaders of Israel, then God is going to give it to you. If you want to obey the Greeks, then you're going to obey the Greeks in their full blasphemous arrogance and nearly absolute power. So for a few years, the Antiochus exercised near absolute authority over everything in Jerusalem. And again, it's not the way the Greeks normally ruled. It's not even the way Antiochus ruled other cities. But it did happen in Israel, in Jerusalem, for just a few years. And that leaves us with now this final question is, how does this little horn, if this is all about the end, remember Jesus specifically referred to this transgression that makes desolate. Remember this little expression up here? The transgression that makes desolate, which is the removing of the regular burnt offering and the setting up of the, by the way, of the statue of Zeus. Why did Antiochus remove the regular burnt offering? Well, you remember what the burnt offering was. It was an offering every morning and every evening where you burnt the whole of the animal. On some of the sacrifices, different types of sacrifices, you only burnt part of the animal. But with the regular daily burnt offering, you burnt the whole creature. And why did you do that? Because every morning and every evening, this sacrifice was a picture of the devotion and the loyalty that every Israelite was to have toward Yahweh. In other words, it represented Israel's first command of absolute loyalty to Yahweh. And that, of course, is what Antiochus took away because he was casting truth to the ground. The Zeus is just a figurehead, not a real God. It's all just, religion is just a way to control people. Your ultimate absolute loyalty has to be to the state, to Antiochus. And whatever Antiochus says is final. He is the prince of the host. He is acting anyway as nearly as a god with absolute power. And so he's a deceiver in that he's throwing the truth of Yahweh to the ground and asserting that falsehood. Okay, but Jesus, when describing all this, appears clearly anyway in Matthew 24. We did this last week, covered this last week, to be referring to the end. That is the time of the end, not just the end of Greece. Why would Jesus be talking in the Olivet Discourse about the end of Greece, which happened almost 200 years before his sermon? He's talking about the future time of the end. And of course, when you look at Daniel 7 way back here, when we looked at Daniel 7, we noticed that all of these descriptions of the little horn, here, another horn, this is referring to the little horn, will arise among them, that seems to be referring to the future, the time when the Son of Man comes on the clouds and so on. So how does this little horn in Daniel 8 relate to all that? And this is the answer. So we've now gone 2 weeks. We're finally getting to an answer. You may not like my answer. You may dismiss it for all I know. It's totally fine with me. I'm used to people, disagreeing with me all the time. So it doesn't matter to me. Maybe you can give me some reason to think differently, and I'm open to it. But the way I think we're supposed to understand this little horn here in Daniel 8 is that this horn is what we would call a prototype. I heard that term from a gentleman named David Gooding. Prototype, or if you want, a template. You all know when you create a document, you can create a template, right? Like say you're gonna sell your car and you need a bill of sale. So you create a template for the bill of sale, right? And then every time thereafter that you sell a car, you don't restart by making a whole new document, right? You just go back to your master template, and then you add in all new information and change it accordingly. So I think that what Daniel is being offered by God in the vision, and the reason that this vision is for the time of the end, and the reason Jesus refers to the abomination or the transgression that makes desolate, which is the golden statue or altar of Zeus set up in the temple, where you're demanded to offer your sacrifices no longer to Yahweh and express your deepest devotions, primary devotions to him. Instead, you have to express your devotion to Zeus and to the Greeks and to Antiochus. In other words, this is similar to chapter 3 in Daniel, right? Where the three friends of Daniel have to bow down and worship the golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar. Not of Nebuchadnezzar, but the one Nebuchadnezzar set up. That brief reign of Antiochus is a kind of prototype or a template of what the little horn at the end of history will be like. So in Daniel 7, the little horn comes at the very end of all the beasts before the Son of Man. He's what triggers the coming of the Son of Man. And so this little horn from Greece in around 170 BC, what Antiochus actually did is a kind of prototype or a template for what the greater little horn will do at the time of the end, meaning the end of history. Okay? Now, some people, just to close up shop because we're a little late, some people think that the time of the end that's referred to in Daniel 8 is just the end of Persia and Greece. That's another way people interpret it. Just so you know, you could, if you feel more comfortable with that, you're welcome to explore that a little more. For my part, I think that the little horn in Daniel 7 is referred to quite a bit, actually, in the New Testament, in the book of 2 Thessalonians, as well as in the book of the Revelation, though I won't go deeply into that right now. You can look at that if you want to. I'm not trying to argue here a kind of particular vision for the end of the world, but this mysterious figure, I think, comes up in the New Testament in both the Lord's reference on Mount Olivet discourse to the abomination that makes desolate. Jesus mentions this in Matthew 24. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 describes what I think is a mysterious figure who is known for what? For teaching people the lie. That is, he's a deceiver like Antiochus was, and he demands worship. According to 2 Thessalonians 2, he will demand worship. And then, of course, there's the reference to the beast in the book of the Revelation, who also is a deceiver and demands that people worship him and his statue that he sets up. And for whatever, so in other words, I see their continuity. I see a pattern. It seems to me they're all referring to a similar figure at the end of history. And therefore, I take Daniel 8's description of the little horn as a template, a model, a thought model, or a prototype from history about the end time. All right. By no human hand. I think, Anne-Marie, the reason it says by no human hand here in 25, note what it says here. Let's get some of the green away. See if I can do that. It's not, okay, hold on there. And then there, delete. There we go. Okay, it says that by his cunning, his deception, he will make deceit prosper under his hand. And of course, his greatness is in his own mind. But then by no human hand. He is broken. And that's usually a way of saying that he's not defeated by other humans, but by God. It's God who defeats him. It's not humans who defeat him. In among the beasts, right? When it says the goat comes and defeats the ram, that of course is a human defeating other humans. The conspicuous horn that comes out of the goat is Alexander the Great. The other four horns are humans. So the animals are being destroyed by other animals. It's human on human. But for Antiochus, it's saying he's not going to be defeated in battle by a human. That's not how he's going to perish. Now, how he actually dies, well, he does not die in a battle. He dies of some sickness or something. He does not die in a battle. It's not the Romans who defeat Antiochus Epiphanes, the little horn. And so Daniel doesn't want to say he simply dies by a sickness. That's not what God gives to Daniel in the vision. The vision is simply that this little horn falls down dead without anybody killing him. There's not an assassination or anything. He just dies. And therefore, by no human hand implies that God himself intervened to kill Antiochus. It took God, the divine power of God, the Prince of Princes, is the one who destroys him. But note what it doesn't say. It doesn't say that the Son of Man comes on the clouds and is the one who destroys him. Okay, according to history, it seems anyway, Antiochus died just from sickness shortly after his reign of terror over Jerusalem. All right, I know that chapter. Sorry, I went so long here today. I know that chapter has lots of intricate details of history, and I have taken you probably put way too much information in front of you to try and give a large account of what was going on with Antiochus in the historical setting. But the big takeaway is that, before we close, is that Jesus himself refers to this description in Daniel 8. And there'll be another echo of it in Daniel 9. And he refers to it in Matthew 24 when describing the end of history. And so the value of it is in telling us, it's not about trying to tell us who or identify who is this little horn at the end of history. The point is to tell us what the little horn is going to be like. What is his nature? What is his mission? What is his goal? And his goal will be to absolutely destroy any witness for the true God in the world. Remember, Jerusalem's temple was the sole light, the sole witness for the true God. And by trying to banish all of the temple worship for Yahweh and to banish the Torah and so on and circumcision, what that means is that the little horn was trying to obliterate all witness for the true God in the world. And that's what the little horn at the end of history will try to do. All right, this leaves Daniel terrified and alarmed, as you can imagine. So it's a very, it's not a pleasant image of that bit about the end of history. All right, let me just quick